I'm Sally McCartan, and I handle communications for Take the Lead. As part of that, I am continuously scouring stories and studies about women in the workplace. And this year, obviously, was a big one. From the brilliant term mansplaining to the chains of stories about women's ideas about being ignored and then repurposed by male colleagues or being interrupted, whether it was Kamala Harris in the Senate or just in everyday offices all over the country, women were talking about what it meant to not be heard, and they were pushing back. Power tool number 8 in Gloria Feld's seminal book, No Excuses, is employ every medium, and that's what this panel is about. It's how to cut through and deliver our messages clearly and fully out in the world. It's about using every medium at our disposal to make sure the stories we want and to need to tell, the perspectives we need to share, are out in the world. For women to reach parity in our lifetimes, our ideas as well as our titles need to rise to the top. We've assembled a panel of wonderful journalists here today to get you started. Each of them has crafted stories that are important and have made sure that underrepresented voices are heard. Sarah Maslin-Nir, who will be leading this panel, epitomizes that description. She began her reporting career as a freelancer and at one point had written for something like 11 sections in the New York Times, so she covered everything. Today, she's a staff reporter for the New York Times. Her series on the working conditions of the women in all of New York's numerous nail salons led to extensive regulatory changes. So that is, that's what you want a journalist to be able to do. And it puts Sarah on the finalist list for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize. So welcome, Sarah Maslin-Nir, and have a great time at this panel. Esteemed panelists, follow me up here. Let's see. Oh, we're good.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, every one of these amazing organizers who went in to putting on this monumental multi-city, multi-platform event. One thing that really interested me about this panel is it's not a panel, it's not a talk, it's not a symposium, it's a workshop. And so I think that's really important because we can talk all we want, but we need tools. We need strategy, all of that, either one. And we need action plans. And when in our conversations prior to this, where we strategized what we were going to talk about, one of the things that we wanted to pull out was, didn't you just say it? You get a great word for it, Michelle, actionable.
I just said actionable items. That's
actionable items. It's so jargony, but I love it. Let's co-opt the jargon. Actionable items for women to take over the world. Have parity. So I wanted to start with that question of my colleagues here. What would you say, Natasha, that would be your first tool for a woman to find her voice in the world of media or the wider world?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here and taking this time to be with us and to listen and exchange ideas. When you asked that question, Sarah, the first thing I think of is a quote from Michelle Obama. And she said, this was recently at the Obama Foundation Summit, before you can use your voice, you have to find your voice. And I think it's tempting to think that leadership just happens like anywhere. I think that you have to ask yourself what your highest and your best calling in the use of your voice is. And I know that personally, very early in my career, right out of college, I was looking for the leadership title, right? I thought that that is how I would make a difference in the world. And so my first job out of school was actually at a hedge fund as a management associate, even though I'd spent all of college working at the Women's Center and volunteering with young students. And so in that space, I wasn't able to authentically use my voice. I wasn't able to advocate for the issues that I cared about. And even though it looked really great on paper, I wasn't feeling like the leader that I needed to be. And so I actually found my voice through making a career change. And first I became a teacher. I worked in education for about 4 years, which is an incredible place to lead. You learn firsthand about leadership in the classroom. But then I ultimately became a journalist. And that is where I felt most authentic and most real. And I get to write stories about women's issues. I get to focus on underrepresented and marginalized voices. And I think that if I hadn't made that change, I would have been maybe a leader on paper, but not truly where it mattered the most. So the first tool I would say is just to do some self-reflection and ask yourself what your platform is, where you're leading from, and are you being your most authentic self?
And Michelle, you had a real controversial tool, and I love it.
Yeah, so my tool is your anger. So the reason why I say that is I think that as women, especially for me and a lot of us as women of color, the first thing you're supposed to tuck away is any kind of discomfort or just anything that might look ugly or victimish on you. So, I mean, I was told that. I was bred to be a very good girl by my Mexican mother, and I was writing very good girlish stories for places like Women's Day and, various different women's publication glamour, until I started to realize, why am I the only person of color in this newsroom, and why is the entire filter by which our story of our country is told through only one small, narrow lens? So that feeling of rage that would wake me up and put me to bed every day, like, instead of eating me alive, I decided to make it my currency. So what I did was I actually wrote a few op-eds. I made a lot of public statements that had me like physically shaking, but which led to my becoming the editor-in-chief of a sub-brand of Cosmopolitan, because I was able to convince them that they were not doing a good job of talking to my community.
But there's a risk in that, right? There's a risk, you said, getting branded as, the angry Latina, or the meme we hear of the angry black woman.
Right.
But how do you overcome that risk, or how do you balance that risk?
Well, I think that you have to channel that anger into a next step, and you have to have a solution to your own problem. A lot of times you can't just walk in there saying, include me, do something, figure this out. It's like you have to have it kind of half figured out yourself. It's more like, you have a problem, but guess what? I have a solution. So it's like making that anger land in a place that moves the conversation forward, that opens a new avenue, and that takes everybody a step forward, I think.
And Katie, your whole platform is a tool. Can you talk about your work?
Yes, but yeah, I feel like both of these questions, all three of us could just bridge together. Yeah, I run an organization called the OpEd Project. So if you're, after you've done some reflection and after you've gotten really angry, if you want some very practical tools on how to channel your voice, we're a really good place for you to be. We run very creative experimental programs where we think about what we know, why we know it, what we've been given permission to know, and how we can think outside that permission box and do and say things of consequence. And we also talk a lot about what happens when you say things of consequence. As you just pointed out to Michelle, my dear colleague, there can be consequences. And we have a slogan that we say all the time. If you say things of consequence, there may be consequences. The alternative is to be inconsequential.
Well, that's so good. Everybody write it down. Yeah. Tweet it. One more time. Say it again. Do it again.
If you say things of consequence, there may be consequences. The alternative is to be inconsequential.
Ooh, Shazam.
I want to just offer one really practical, not just what we do, but why we do it. There's multiple reasons why we do it, but the story we tell becomes the world we live in. So it's not just about us, it's about all the people around us and the communities and the world, the environment, our schools, our families, our destinies. The story we tell isn't just an act of self-realization or self-affirmation or self-knowledge. It's also, and this is kind of what Michelle was saying, it's also a solution for the world and for others. And ultimately, the story that we tell, the very narrow story told by a small number of people who don't really look like any of us in this room, that story is shaping what wars we fight, what diseases we fund, who will go to college, who will go to prison, who the police force will protect or not, who will get birth control, and who will go down in history books. So it's not just a nice, sort of self-actualization idea to tell the story. It's also a part of a responsibility we have to the world. And that's sort of the why of what we do. And some of the things, you asked about tools. So some of the things we do are also incredibly practical. We founded 9 years ago, and we do a lot of things that are far beyond 9 years ago. But the question that started what we do 9 years ago is, there was a big debate that broke out in the world. Why are there so few voices? Why are there so few? Why are there so few women in particular? And the state of the conversation at that time was a conversation about largely three things: biology, sexism, and socialization. And I followed that conversation with a lot of interest because I study and write about these things, but also because I'm a writer and I was writing for some of the publications that were weighing in on this. And they were wondering why there are so few women on their op-ed pages. And actually, my editors had told me something very direct and simple that was much simpler than that big debate about biology, sexism, and socialization. And it's this: the single greatest predictor of who gets published and who gets heard is who pitches. The ratio is almost 1-to-1, meaning that like the ratio of who pitches is almost identical to the ratio of who gets published. At the Washington Post, the year we founded, 2008, 9 out of 10 submissions came from men, 9 out of 10 pitches came from men, and 9 out of 10 published pieces came from men. And so we began with a very simple idea, which is why don't we just increase the submission ratio, the number of smart women pitching? And the premise is really simple. You cannot win a game if you're not playing it. And this game is called history.
Oh, God, write that one down too. I'm going to include myself as a panelist here because I also work in this space. I have a club at the New York Times called the Old Girls Club, which is a play on, obviously, the Old Boys Club that journalism is. And I started it because I read a line in Tina Fey's Bossy Pants, where she says that every time a woman writer would come into the writer's room, the existent women writers, of which there are very few, would bristle. And she called that a girl-on-girl hate crime. And I thought, I am seeing women of my demographic at the Times, of which there are many more now, but there were quite just a few, as mild competition, as at baseline. And I thought women never go for beers with each other, and we don't have that old boys clubby mentality. And I decided that seeing them as competition was a girl-on-girl hate crime. And I stopped and created this club. And one thing in the club, we go around the table and we all say, one thing we've done since we last met that we're proud of. And the only rule, there's only one rule of the Old Girls Club, and I make everyone shout it at the beginning of each meeting, and it is, there's no modesty. And my friends outside of the Times call it Boast Club. But there's no modesty because that is, I think, a socializing aspect. And I can't, one of you wanted to address that, but you'll jump in with it. The undermining modesty, and that in an effort to not be seen in a negative way as a woman or from whatever demographic you're from, to undermine yourself. And it's deeply inculcated, and it's so pathological that I call it pathological modesty. And we go around this table, and we have to shake each other out of it. Oh, that was luck, or I had a really big break. No, you achieved. And so my actionable tool would be to identify the narrative you tell yourself that prevents you from doing. The way I started the New York Times is I had a chat with a colleague at my journalism school who hadn't gotten an internship at the Financial Times, very prestigious paper. And he had just found out he hadn't gotten it. He turned to me, tears in his eyes, and he said, I didn't get it because I'm not blue-blooded enough. He was the first man in his family to ever graduate college, and here he was at grad school, at Columbia Journalism School. And he said, I didn't get it because I'm not blue-blooded enough. And I turned to him and I said, you didn't get it because you're not good enough. Good enough you can fix. Blue-blooded enough, this narrative, you can never change. And I went home and I thought to myself, what are my storylines that I tell myself that prevent me from succeeding? And that time it was, I don't write for the New York Times because I'm not good enough to write for the New York Times. The reality was, I didn't write for the New York Times because I wasn't writing for the New York Times. I stayed up all night. I pitched everyone I could find on the internet, and in the morning I had 2 front-page stories. So these are the narratives you have to identify, and then you have to erase them and write new narratives.
And that reminds me of imposter syndrome, right?
Absolutely.
It's the story that you tell yourself about not belonging, not maybe deserving to be in the room, and the fear that you have of being found out, right? If you were to put yourself on a big platform and somehow make a mistake or say something that you couldn't stand behind or that someone broke down, then you would be exposed as not deserving. But it's through, like you were saying, the pitching again and again, you get the feedback, you learn, you grow, and you're in the game and you can actually play. But if you refuse to put yourself out there or see yourself as worthy and deserving, then you don't actually get to win.
Beautifully said. Michelle, you had a really, really strong point that we can give all these tools and we can say all these things, but who's listening to us matters, and their own perspective really defines how they can use these tools. Will you talk about that?
Sure, of course. I mean, I'm on panels like this. I've been on panels like this for about 20 years all around the country. And I love being in cities like New York because, it's just a hive of smart people. But I like to get out of New York too. And I think the story I told you was about going down to Phoenix, Arizona, right? Where I was in a room of mostly Native and Mexican-American women. And I do have, my great-grandmother was Native, so I don't really like to throw that out there because I don't want to get into the whole who's Native enough, whatever. But in this room, there had been nobody Native that had ever shown up in any kind of way and talked to them and asked them to stand up and express their opinion in any kind of way. And I feel like I've never intimidated anybody in my life, to be honest with you, because I'm always like so nice. But this woman came up to me, and she was so intimidated to talk to me, she had to hold somebody's hand to even say anything. And I was just looking at her like, what is happening here? That I'm here for you. I flew down here for you, and you can't even talk to me. And I realized there's a big gap between what happens and what we all say to each other here and what everybody does when they go home. Like, how does that apply to me? I'm not a badass like her. I don't have a cool story. Maybe I was from a suburb. Maybe I'm from Poughkeepsie. I don't know. There maybe people don't have something that they think is really, that's a real space on a real person, by the way. It's like maybe I don't have anything of consequence to say. Maybe I'm not even that angry, or it's not original enough. And because of that, I would simply say that there's something that's burning you up. I don't care who you are or what you're about or where you're from. You see a gap somewhere, and you see it your way. Just because everybody else sees it, we're all looking into the same hole of no women and no people of color and Donald Trump is president or whatever, right? But how do we see it, and what do we have to offer? What do I have to say, or what do I have to do? And I promise you, it's different than me or anybody else here.
You said you give almost 2 different talks depending on your audience. Could you define the one and the other with
Sure.
a crowd of mostly white audience and a crowd of color?
If I'm talking to a mostly white or mainstream audience, I talk about often how you should make yourself uncomfortable, and being uncomfortable is important. That if something is uncomfortable to you, you should dive in, because I see a lot of people staying in their lane all the time, right? In terms of culturally staying in their lane. So I think even being an activist of any kind, or even a business person, requires you jumping into the black hole and opening up a new space, right? But when I talk, the funny part is when I talk to women of color, especially Latinas, I talk about something really different, which is about standing out. It's almost a completely different thing, because a lot of Latinas that I talk to have what I call gray suit syndrome, where they've seen women in power wearing a gray suit and having perfectly straightened hair and perfect makeup, and they think, if only I looked like her, I could get what she has. And then they get there and they're boring to everybody because they look like everybody else, or they don't say anything. Or maybe if I'm quiet in the meetings, people just notice me someday because I'm so well behaved. Because we're taught to be very well behaved. We are. We're taught not to mouth off, and certainly not to question authority. And having a voice does not mean blending in. Having a voice means sticking out like a very sore, red, flaming thumb, And I had to get over that. I still have to get over it.
Katie, we'd spoken earlier about that, though. There's a double-edged sword about asserting your voice or not.
Yeah, I want to just respond to one thing, a very important thing that Michelle is saying, but I want to just double down on it, which is having a voice and having your say and having your unique voice isn't just for you. It's also, we all have a right and a responsibility, both the right, but also the responsibility to shape the world we live in. And somehow we live in a world where we've gotten this completely flawed idea that there should be this hierarchy where some people tell the story for the rest of us and who get told. And somehow we have to step through that idea and understand that it's not just about us, it's about the entire world, that standing out and having a voice is not just for you, it's for everyone around us. And then the other thing I want to add, we talked about this, but you also mentioned it, imposter syndrome, and you talked about shattering old stories. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that those stories come from somewhere. It's not like some internal biological flaw that women or people of color possess. It's a flaw in the culture which tells us those stories, We live in a culture, I swear a lot, so I'm just going to swear. We live in a culture that I call an uneven shitstorm. And it affects some of us much harder than others. And it's real. So if we're going to retell those stories, if we're going to shatter those stories or get past imposter syndrome, we have to recognize where it comes from. And for example, for women, if you want to step out of your feelings of being an imposter or into a new story that you deserve to be on the front page, you also have to acknowledge that putting yourself out there, well, you don't have to acknowledge, but anyway, the research acknowledged that putting yourself out there and asserting yourself, the more assertive you are and the more fancy degrees you have and the greater your ability to demonstrate competence, negatively corresponds with likability for women. It positively corresponds with likability for men. So for men, it's all green lights all the way. High reward, low risk. To sell yourself all day long. High reward, low risk. For women, it's high risk, low reward. For women of color, it's even higher risk, lower reward. Not only that, an interesting element is the more accomplished you are and the more underrepresented you are creates an even more precarious situation because you have a lot of risk and further to fall. And somehow, we have to navigate our way through that because that's a very real dynamic. Probably everyone in this room has felt it sometime sooner or later. I can't imagine that anyone in this room hasn't imagined suppressing a really fancy accomplishment like the boast fest, brag fest. Why is that even necessary?
Exactly.
Because we all have the experience of suppressing and we know why, maybe not consciously, maybe consciously, but maybe not consciously. Maybe we just know it in our gut that there's a problem with doing that. We don't want to look like we're bragging. We don't want to be in the camp of people who are, oh, that's a brassy, unlikable person. We know that there's a risk, a negative consequence to bragging. And yet, if we can't share our biggest accomplishments, it gets in the way of our already difficult, very difficult challenge of being heard. So somehow we have to find a cha-cha through that.
Natasha, I've created the Old Girls Club, but your entire organization or platform is creating a space for voices to be heard. I mean, so these are some of the solutions, is to go out and create these spaces to give voice. Can you talk about cultivating different voices in your own work?
Absolutely. So I work for TheGrio.com. We're almost 10 years old, and we came from a simple idea that started as a documentary. Our founder, David Wilson, was trying to find the man he found a man who was related to the family's slave holders, the slave owners of his family. So there's another David Wilson, right? A white man and a black man coming together. And so it started with a conversation on NBC. And then he said, what if we have a site that's dedicated to telling the stories of African Americans that we've never heard, that have been buried, that have died over time? And so he pitched it to NBC, and we became a vertical under NBC. And then we decided to step out on our own. And so we went independent from NBC and, developed the website, developed our video channel, and we're now owned by Byron Allen, who's an African-American media mogul out in California, also a comedian. And so I think even just the story of the way that TheGrio has developed is an example of finding your own voice and taking the lead, because there is power in us having an African-American owner and being able to editorially say whatever we want to say, to educate the African-American community, to challenge society at large. And so for me, this is very different because I started as a local news reporter. So I was in the snow, I had the straight hair and the blazer and my voice as a journalist was very controlled and conservative, and the stories that I could tell looked one way. And when I decided to take that risk and to go out to TheGrio, I didn't know what was going to happen. But again, I found my voice. And so as the deputy editor at TheGrio.com, I am always looking to elevate the voices of women. In fact, one of the women who was on our Facebook Live is in the audience today, and I was like, come to Powertopia. Hey, Jennifer. But that is an example of, I think Black women in particular, they see me and they're like, oh, she's deputy editor. I'm going to pitch to her. It feels safer, it feels like there's a connection, and I'm absolutely rooting for them. I want to put their stories up. We don't get enough women of color pitching us for political op-eds, and so I've been trying to find women to talk about the politics that are happening in our country. But most importantly, I understand that at TheGrio, being deputy editor, every story I choose to cover or don't cover, that changes the way that the conversation that happens in my community. So while stories about Real Housewives do get a lot of clicks, instead, I chose to go visit Patty Russo over at the Women's Campaign School at Yale and spend the day with her. I told the newsroom, I'm out, guys. I got a story. They're training the next, women who are running for president. I'm trying to be there. And believe it or not, that story did really well. We got thousands of likes on that story about the women who were at your campaign school who wanted to run for office. And we spotlighted the women of color in that program. So shout out to you, Patty, for the work that you're doing. But yes, so the point of that entire monologue was that being able to be in a position where you choose the stories that go up shapes the entire conversation, and putting yourself in that place, I think, is really important.
To pivot off of you, I think that we are speaking about this as it's just a good, and we're not analyzing why it's a good. We feel like we all know in our gut that yes, it's good to get our voices out there, but there are very real consequences to our voices being absent. I wrote a big expose on New York City nail salons, and one of the questions I get asked often is, could a man have done that story? I embedded for a year in the city's nail salons, interviewed over 250 workers, mostly undocumented, all exclusively immigrant. And they said, could they have done that story? I said, absolutely yes. A man could have done this story all about women, but would he have? And that's the real question. What do we lose by not having our voices in the room? I actually would have an opposite experience of yours, that you said you're approachable. And also, by the way, that was an open invitation for a pitch, everybody. So, get her email
Contributor
later.
at TheGrio.com.
Yeah. Really write that down. But, I get emails from young women all the time, and I do talks like this all the time. And I always say to people, if you are in a room with someone whose job you want, get their email, write them an email with like some random compliment, read a little bit of their work, say something nice about them, and use it. And I get all these emails from people, will you have a coffee with me? And I say, I'm sorry, I have too many requests of a coffee, but here's my phone number. I'll be free between the hours of this and this, call me. Guess how many call? Almost none. They all say, oh my God, yes, I will, and almost none of them call. And it's really, really astounding. I had a room of 250 Columbia students I gave my phone number to. One called, an ex-boyfriend of mine. It was wild. And again, I think this is the narrative issue, the narratives in our heads. And my father, who was a Holocaust survivor with barely a fifth grade education, who ended up being a medical doctor in America. He went to school after that. But I have a little story I'm going to tell, and it involves men, but it can involve anyone. My father was on his way back from being rejected for a job at a coffee shop in Israel, right before like 1948, and he ran into a woman, and she said, where did you come from, Yehuda? And he said, oh, I just couldn't get a job as a barista. I have no credentials because I was hiding from Hitler during the war. And he said, where are you coming from? She said, I came from the bank. And the bank was giving out loans to go to school because Israel was just forming as a state and it was an incentive. And my dad said, congratulations. And she said, what are you congratulating me for? He said, congratulations for applying for the loan. And she goes, oh, I didn't apply. I wouldn't get that loan. And my dad walked straight to the bank and applied for the loan with the motto, let them say no first. And that is my life motto. Let them say no first before you tell yourself no. And my dad got the loan, and that's what made his entire life possible. I think there is something in the fact that it was a woman who didn't apply for that bank loan. And I've actually never thought of that aspect of the story till just now. And I love that story. But why didn't she apply? Why don't we apply in the figurative sense for all the things that we could? Don't do them the favor of saying no on their behalf. Let them say no before you tell yourself no. That's definitely my takeaway from these types of interactions.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I just wanted to, you just actually sparked something in me. I was thinking about the fact that this right here, all of us, is such a beautiful conversation, and we're learning from each other right now. But for people like me, Katie, Natasha, everybody, we have this conversation every day, right? Because we have our sort of hive of collaborators and supporters. And when you deal with consequences, so having that hive of collaborators and supporters makes a huge difference, right? And I just wanted to point out that we're not alone, and we do have each other, and that we do have a lot to learn from each other. So that means like when people say they invite you to join their community. Don't invite them to join yours. Join theirs first. Be of service to your sisters, and your sisters will give back to you. The only reason why I say that is that, like I said, I've done hundreds of these. I've offered to, look over people's business plans. I've offered to, connect people to editors or whatever, and nobody ever emails me or takes me up on my offer. I get, a 0 response rate, actually. And
Gloria Steinem, one of her big takeaways when she does talks, she says, find communities of women, if only to turn to each other and say, wait, you too? I'm not crazy? And that's a really valuable interaction. You're not alone, and you can muddle through things together. Take people up on it, and also offer.
Yeah, offer and support each other. Because we're talking about controversy and consequences, right? And we go on a limb all the time, and sometimes the table turns against you, and then everybody backs away, scurries away, I don't want to be connected to this, this pariah now. But what if we stood next to each other anyway, even though things were, I'm talking about people that we know and we trust and we believe. What if we said, Me Too, not just when it was a celebrity hashtag?
So I just want to take a moment to say, Sarah, that story you wrote was extraordinary. And if you haven't read that story, you should all read it. It was I just want to say a magnificent story.
Wow.
And really important for a lot of people, not just a story about information, a story that changed a lot of people's lives. I also want to say, because there's a lot of us are talking about the need to speak up, but also sometimes there's a lack of information or a lack of people doing it near you. Because a lot of times we're not in the circles, and if we're not in the circles of people who are regularly pitching and regularly calling and regularly asking for money, not only do we not get the idea that we should do it too, but we lack the practice or the people near us giving us information. So I just want to give a very practical shout out. Our organization runs programs open to the public almost every single weekend in a different city. This Sunday we're in Seattle, and next weekend we are in, I forget, but we'll be in New York City on December 2nd and 3rd, and anyone can come regardless of means. We run a whole day. The curriculum of the day is essentially how do we understand what we know so that we can use it and ask for more. And also, if you follow along and you at the end of the day, you'll also have an op-ed and be able to be matched with a mentor like the amazing Michelle Mulligan here.
Wait, what's the website? Come on,
the
everybody
website
needs
is
that.
It's theopedproject.org. Theopedproject.org.
Can I actually ask a question, Katie, even though I'm a panelist? What advice would you give to women who want to write op-eds who are afraid of pushback and blowback? So I remember the first op-ed I wrote, taking off my deputy editor hat, was about R. Kelly and his inappropriate relationships with young women. And lots of people weren't happy with that. They ripped me apart in the comments. They were upset about it. I got over it because that's part of my job. But for people who are new to that, what would you recommend?
I'm going to give a quick recommendation with a caveat that we talk a lot about this. And the quick recommendation is you don't want to walk into something not having imagined the potential consequences. You want to know what you're walking into so that you're not walking into it lightly. That's the whole, if you say things of consequence, there may be consequences. And if you've thought about those, then you may have thought about your strategies for addressing them and whether or not they're acceptable to you. Because there are people out there doing things at great risk, but they've chosen that risk. You don't want to be a person walking into the fray blinded by not having thought about it. But one of the things we do in our program is we spend a fair amount of time talking about opposition, dealing with opposition, and a concept called a to be sure, how you might even preempt or frame or think about the kind of pushback that you might get even in advance so that you have a chance to shape the conversation before the blowback comes in. But at the end of the day, if you're not facing any controversy, it means you're probably in the parking lot, not in the ring.
If I could answer your question as well, about 6 months after my nail salon story came out, a huge amount of regulatory changes happened. So there was not a peep from any of the people we wrote about until the 6-month mark, when people had to do things like pay for insurance in case you closed up shop and defrauded your workers, or New York became the first state in the country to require ventilation systems in nail salons. And believe it or not, there were people 1,000 people outside my office building holding pictures of my face with my eyes crossed out, saying, the jury's out on whether these chemicals are bad. Don't punish the owners by making them buy ventilation systems. Meanwhile, the owners sit in the salons too, and so do their kids. But beside the point, I cost people a lot of money. And there was a lot of pushback. And took a very, very personal turn, I think partly because of how I look, because I'm not the person you expect to do a groundbreaking investigation, as I think anyone with a vagina is not expected. Because, editors had said, we never saw people's faces mounted. And they screamed, Sarah Near the party girl is writing this. How could she be credible? I think the answer is Sarah Near the woman. How could she be credible? I never expected that, but I did expect consequences. And I worked so hard for those consequences. When people would say, oh, I didn't say that I was defrauding the worker, I would say, would you like the MP3, the Chinese translation, or the English transcription of you saying that? And having those extra layers of effort and of investment and of work, I think maybe something a woman has to do, possibly more than a man when you put yourself in the public space. But I had done my homework in triplicate. And that's why the story ended up impervious to the assault. To make yourself impervious to the assault. Weren't you right about R. Kelly? Don't you still stand behind what you said?
I still stand behind it.
Absolutely. Then you're Teflon. And I turned to a friend the third protest, and I said, I just don't think I have a thick enough skin for this. And she said, Sarah, this is how you get a thick skin. I think I'd like to open the floor up to some questions, because I have a lot of questions in the front. Oh, wait, hold on. Promised I was going to do this. Questions. Everybody knows what a question is. A comment, a story about something you knew. Don't do it. It's boring. Everyone hates it. A question. Okay, go, front row.
So I am inspired by each and every one of you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to do a story, but
Yes.
I am the mother of two very strong-willed young ladies, and I wondered in any of your work do you mentor young voices? I have high schoolers, and wondered as you open your door up to inviting people to come, and in the spirit of this session, how can we shape this next generation in the future?
So I work with an organization called Foundation for Letters, and their website is called, I think it's foundationforletters.net, and they're doing external support to city schools throughout New York City, and they're expanding to Chicago, where they offer programs for young kids of any background who want to learn to write. And they have world-class writers that help them with their college essays. And I don't know if they're really doing the type of OpEd-ish, stuff that we're talking about here, but they're doing they get a lot of really big deal writers in with that program.
And I also think I can speak for all of us that we have no age limit on who can ask for advice. Let's start them young.
Yeah.
Second question? In the back?
Yeah, I wonder what you guys think about the fact that a lot of times when women exercise voice and even demonstrate authority and power, they are often policed not just by other men, but by other women. That a lot of times we have trouble changing our socialization or our attitudes even towards one another and aligning in support of us speaking out rather than saying, oh yeah, well, she hasn't quite read the memo that says we ought to be marching in line here. And I often find that one of the difficulties we face in speaking out is that we don't actually align behind each other. In fact, oftentimes we'll join into the fray. And I just wonder what you think about that. There's something in there that has to
Okay, let's have Natasha.
being old power instead of reflecting new ways we want to be.
Natasha?
Absolutely. When you say that, the first thing that comes to mind is within the Black community, the division over Bill Cosby. And when women were speaking out, who we wanted to believe and what this means to our community. And I think that there were brave voices who said that this is an area where we do need to come together. I think about Jemele Hill and the fact that when she spoke out, she was suspended. But what I did love was that there were so many journalists today who stood behind her. They posted the number to ESPN and they said that we were going to call. So there are actionable ways to stand behind someone, and I think that when someone is under fire, as we were talking about before, not just saying we support them, but showing that we support them. Ava DuVernay, she stood with the LA Times when Disney said that they wouldn't allow LA Times access anymore over, a debate over a story. Even though her movie is a Disney movie, A Wrinkle in Time, she said, I stand with those journalists because they deserve access. So I think that there are opportunities that when we speak, there really is power behind it, standing together.
Hi, Katie, my question is for you. You started to touch on the fact that this is your job to speak out. What I'm trying to say is, for the rest of us where this isn't our job, how do we get over that fear? Or maybe any of you can address this, but how do we get over that fear to actually speak? Whether it's anger, but it's that fear is real. To be able to speak publicly, all of you are in public positions, and that's your choice. But for many of us, we have other jobs. How do we move beyond that when it isn't our job to speak publicly?
Let me just say on a note on the role of fear. Has anyone ever heard that, what would I do if I was not afraid? And I always heard that, and it was just, but I am afraid, so that's no use to me. I am afraid. And I just feel like I need to do a mental edit. What would I do even though I'm afraid? I think the role of fear is to let us know that something meaningful is at stake. But we don't want that on our tombstones, do we? Didn't do what was meaningful to us for fear of anything, right? I mean, I think like a lot of us are talking about the same thing here, but it helps to be super clear, like imagining forward to our tombstone. If we don't want it on our tombstone, we gotta find a way around to live our lives that's not on our tombstone. Do you know what I mean by that? What I mean by that is it's not just my job, it's each of our jobs to live a life in keeping with our conviction. And when we talk about voice or story, because you talk about story, like my job and my orientation is we want to tell our stories, not just with our words, but with our lives. That's the endeavor. That's the endeavor, and my job is not to tell my story. My job is both to tell my story and to tell my story with the voices I lift up.
And I think I heard a whisper of a narrative, of an internal narrative in your question, that you aren't the type of person who's a public person, that you don't have a position. And I would question that. I mean, yes, all of us were drawn probably by our personalities to a profession where we are public. But our profession is giving voice to people who don't do that for a living, right? I'll give you a little example. Again, in my nail salon story, at the very end, I was fact-checking, going back to some of the women I interviewed, and I fact-checked with a woman who became very, very distraught. And she called all the other manicurists and freaked them out. She said, this is terrible, it's going out live tomorrow. And one of my main protagonists called me and she said, Sarah, what have you done? My husband is furious at me. I'm going to lose everything, blah, blah. And I said, we've been working together for months. Nancy, you've had me in your home. We had photographers. I've met with you 15 times. You wanted to tell this story. She was a woman who had a miscarriage and believed it was related to the chemicals that she was surrounded by, as they all are. And I said, you wanted to tell this story. And she said, but I'm not this kind of person, blah, blah. And I said, I'll take your name out of the story. Meanwhile, I'm like, no, I'm taking your name out of the story. I was like, I said, but this is your story, and it's very surprising to me that you don't want to tell it, because it's not just for you, it's for the other women, isn't it? Isn't that what you've been telling me? She got super quiet, and I could hear her sobs, and she said, and this is an undocumented immigrant with everything to lose, and she said, Sarah, whatever you do, keep my name in your story. And this is a woman who is voiceless, finding a voice. I'd turn to yourself and listen to her.
I just wanted to add, when you were asking the question, I think about the times in history when I said, what were the people who weren't saying anything doing? Like, what were they up to when the dogs were biting people in the streets and the fire hoses were out there? So I think we can choose to be those people who are unwritten in history, but who maybe stood by and allowed things to happen. Or you can live at peace with kind of being on the right side of history. Whatever it is the issue that matters to you most is, I think that is one way to think about it.
And one last thing I just wanted to add on that is there can sometimes be a weird like silver lining or happy ending, even when you take a huge risk. Like I was the editor-in-chief of a magazine and I wrote an op-ed against my cover girl, and the same month when it came out too. I mean, I was almost certainly, if I were not Hispanic, I would have been fired. I mean, I can just tell you that. Now that I don't work there anymore. But it's true, though. And, like, the people didn't, I mean, it wasn't even just that. It was the shame of people not even wanting to look me in the eye. Like, going to the bathroom and everybody looking away from me like I was some kind of pariah. And I was like, this woman is going to hate me for the rest of my life. And you know what? She does still kind of not like me. But the people that were on the show that I was criticizing, which I considered to be a minstrel show, all of them came back to me in one way or the other to talk to me about it. And they said, you know, it really hurt me when you wrote that, but it also made me think about what kind of role would be different. I mean, how many roles do we really get as Latinas anyway? What are we supposed to play if we're not playing a drug dealer or a maid or whatever? And I said, well, I mean, I don't know, but what if you thought of something and tried? I mean, what if I thought of something and tried? Like, what if we all did? And, you know, now this woman and I are writing a book together. Not the original one, but this other one. But I hope that I'll win the other one over too. But I'm just saying that sometimes starting the conversation, like with anybody, it's like fighting with a partner. It can be really terrible at first, but it can break new ground later.
I have to do one more pivot off of that one. I love that there was a silver lining, but also let them hate you. Why do we have to be so liked? Fuck them. Come on, we got 2 more questions in you. I feel them in your bellies. There's one back there? Whoever's back there, I can't see you. Just.
Hi. I can't help but notice, of course, that you all are journalists, which also means that you're professional listeners. So I wanted to know, I'm curious about how your listening skills help you both with your voice and with your writing.
That's a nice question.
Do it.
I'm actually not really a journalist. I trained as a folklorist, which is like kind of the opposite in a way. Like, you know, the god of objectivity on this side and the god of versions on this side. But they both require listening to people's stories. And we talk a lot in our work about listening on multiple levels. Listening on the literal level, on the intention, listening for intention, and then listening for emotion. The third one is actually where things are possible to move. If you can notice when something's emotional and ask people to name what they're feeling, you can actually surface things that you might not ever have talked about. So we spend a lot of time, particularly because in the work that we do, in the programs that we run, we're striving more and more to, it's not just about listening, it's about surfacing. So we strive to ask better questions. And so listening through also asking better questions.
And on the other side of that is withholding, interrupting, right? So the moment where, there's been moments where you push and then you get somebody to really open up, and there's a moment where you just wait. And you let that person continue to talk and they take the thought to the next level, and it's a beautiful thing. So two ways.
Okay, I thought I invented that, but it's good that you. I was going to say very, very similar to Natasha, but I want to underline it, that silence and not talking, something that women are quote unquote afflicted with, can be a strength. Don't you want to feel that weird silence I just gave you? I do that in my interviews. I do that in conversations. I wait a beat. I make things uncomfortable. Other people spill in order to fill them. Yeah. And there are womanly strengths that are strong as iron, and we can use them. And that's a tool I use in my interviewing is silence. It is a powerful tool. One more question?
You touched on this a little in the beginning about using your anger to kind of think of a solution and then approach people with it. But you know, like, what if you have your voice and you feel like you're screaming at the top of your lungs, but people aren't taking you seriously? What are some other ideas you have or just experiences that you could share?
I'll start this off. I want the rest of you guys to go in on it too. But I also work with the OpEd project, and this comes up a lot because sometimes we have fellows who write things and it's like screaming into the woods, right, where nobody's there. And then they get discouraged and they don't want to talk again. But the way that what I say to them is that what we're doing everything that we're doing is part of a conversation, right? And sometimes you go to a party and everybody's talking, everybody's in a tight circle and you can't find your way in. But what do? You wait, and then you wait for another entry point, and then you create another entry point. So sometimes the way in is like a really unexpected, weird way. It's like sometimes your voice could be used like, somebody asked me to do a story on soccer once. Let me tell you, I am really not good at sports at all. Like I've never played, I kind of know what it is, but I got on CNN talking about, I was like, of course I got one of the positions wrong. I'm like, I don't know. But they wanted like my voice on the topic, not my knowledge of soccer, if that makes sense. So sometimes when you take on unexpected or new ways, because there's so much happening every day, like if you take on something different, it could shake things up and open a door for a different audience.
I was just going to add that timing is important too. I think that there are people who, at least in the digital news space, who we discover later. They've been working kind of at the grindstone. No one's paying attention to them. They sort of feel irrelevant, and then there's just this moment where everyone is talking about one subject, and we easily find that person, and they become, sort of at the forefront of whatever movement is happening. So I just want to encourage you to, if you know what it is that you care about and you believe in it, to believe that that moment can come and to stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
Can I add, believe that moment can come and stay ready, but also seek out the strategies and the support that can help you get there, which I want to say again, we do that. I would love anyone who wants, and regardless of means, we run programs that are designed to share information and strategy. And a lot of our framework, several people have said things that might be helpful to just, a lot of our framework is, it's how do we live our life in keeping with our conviction? How do we, as I said before, how do we tell our stories, not just with our words, but with our lives? But one distinction that we make is, while we're having that conversation, many things come up, and we just call those considerations, like I might get fired, or fear, or nobody's listening, or my key source might get really upset. And the reason we call them considerations is because we want to identify the thing that is our matters, meaning and mattering to us, the way we want to live our lives as the driver. And then all the things that come up, all the considerations, they do need to be managed because they're real. Like you can walk into things and get fired or hurt or killed or have negative consequences if you don't manage them. If you don't manage them, they're definitely going to manage you. But we do need to share strategies. And that's part of the game is like, how can we find strategies for getting heard? And we're very, there's so many different answers to that. It depends on, where you are at any given moment in time.
Well, I think I have an answer. This whole conversation, this workshop has been about finding tools. I want everybody to look to their left and their right. Come on, look around. Then turn around, look behind you at the row behind you. There are your tools. There are your answers. Rooms like these, people who are with you, people beside you. Network, get each other's contacts, stay in touch, look at each other, if only to ask, as Gloria Steinem says, wait, you too, I'm not crazy, because you are each other's tools. We're the next generation of all this, and we're going to take the lead. Thank you so much.